Hello, everyone, and please try to ignore the Frozen poster that is behind me at the moment. This is going to be my new office, and as you can tell, the lighting is not fantastic, and there's a Frozen poster, and it's pink and purple and blue. So we're working on that, and the quality of the video is not what I wish it would be, but hey, it's fuzzy, and my complexion looks amazing, at least here, but my teeth, looks like I ate spinach for lunch. Triple checked it, brushed. There's nothing between my teeth. This is like the weirdest definition I've ever had on a camera. Anyway, with those things out of the way, I just wanted to say, first of all, thank you for allowing me to do this tonight. Basically, just to let you know, it's really difficult for me to sit and then stand up and to drive and to move. And sometimes when I breathe too deeply, it hurts too. And at first I thought it was just a pulled muscle. I'm still hoping that's kind of what it is, but they're thinking it's my kidneys. And so I'm not allowed to take any over-the-counter medicines because that hurts your kidneys, and anything else is an opioid. I can't take that because then I can't function. I make even less sense when I'm on an opioid painkiller. So let's just try to get through this lecture. And then if you need anything at all, by all means, text me and let me know, and I'll hop online and we could talk, or we could text. We could do whatever you want, if that will help clarify anything. I know that the discussion portion of the class is super helpful. So sorry about all that, but we will have as much of my lecture as I normally give. And if you have any questions, please, again, text them to me and I will find a way to answer them. So we are moving away from the classical Greeks into the classical Roman period. Finally, it took us a little while to get there, and it might seem like a very slow start, but we're actually not that far behind. And the Roman period is a lot easier to sort of comprehend, and it's a lot easier to sort of to lecture on, honestly. Hopefully it was a little bit easier reading, and we can move like right into the medieval period pretty quickly. And I know you haven't read that. That's okay. Tonight, I'm going to give you the classical Romans, and then we're going to talk a little bit of an introduction into the medieval period. So you can watch this video at your own pace. If you need something to put you to sleep tonight, I promise you, this is the video for you. So let's get started. Maybe you could listen to it in your dreams and get osmosis. So we have covered the ancient Greeks, and I told you that during that time period, there was a struggle between rhetoric and truth, or rhetoric and philosophy. Philosophy was known as the study of life, but also as the search for truth. So rhetoric seemed to be oppositional to that, according to Plato. Aristotle said, no, it's a counterpart to that. And of course, the sophists said, we don't care. And Socrates said, what are you guys talking about? All that matters is what we construct when we speak. So we had these four schools of thought about the relationship between rhetoric and philosophy. During those sort of 200 years when we moved from from Greece, because we saw the fall of Greece, into the rise of Rome, what we really saw was that rhetoric was maintained by the sophists, right? And they were the ones who made sure that rhetoric was practiced. And even though it was not the type of rhetoric that Aristotle necessarily would have supported, it was definitely what was keeping rhetoric as a course of study, at least, alive. Teachers and lawyers, we need those. Those are about as secure as death and taxes, right? So you have teachers and you have lawyers, people who speak for you, people who teach you how to speak. Great. So as we move up from Greece into Rome, which, by the way, is Italian, just so we're all clear on that, it's in Italy. Sometimes people tend to forget that. We say classical Roman times, and it's in Italy. And yes, they spoke Latin, and Italian didn't come along until really as a separate language until later. But they were actually still basing everything on the Greek language prior to the establishment of Rome and the use of language as Latin. Which actually was not brought on except by the Catholic Church. So we're in this period, I don't know what language they were speaking. Doesn't matter. We've translated it into English, and that's all that matters. There are actually going to be a few people that I am going to talk about. One of them that I'm not going to talk about too much is Longinus, and Longinus is really known for bringing us to an understanding of the sublime. And what that is to say that something is sublime is to talk about it being pleasurable. And a lot of times it's something that was not pleasurable that we make pleasurable, or that we replace with a pleasurable memory or affiliation so that we can survive whatever bad thing is happening. If you're a supernatural fan, a lot of times Sam will say to Dean, it's called sublimation. And Dean says, yeah, that's sort of my thing. Meaning that when he fights demons or archangels or whatever he's doing, that what he's really doing is he's dealing with his pain, whatever that pain is. And so he sublimates the fighting and makes it feel good to take away whatever's bothering him at that particular moment, which if you watch the show, it's always something different. Another way to think about sublimation is when we mix something that we don't really like to do into something that might be better, or we might think about it differently. So, for example, I, don't like to do laundry, right? Like at all. And I'm lucky. I have a husband who does it for the most part, but every now and then he leaves piles of clean clothes just sitting there. And I'm like, they're going to need to be washed again, right? It drives me nuts. So every now and then I have to fold the clothes or I have to hang them up. So what do I do with that? Well, I think about the end result, right? I think about what I'm doing in that practice that's going to help me. For example, they're going to be folded and put up and they're not going to annoy me anymore. I'm not going to trip over the laundry basket. Those are all good things. But in addition to that, for someone who has the arthritis from the swelling and sarcoidosis, and for someone who the more I use my hands, the better I will be in the future, and someone who needs to work their arms and their joints as much as possible, and that's me, although today is not that day. But generally speaking, it feels good to complete that task. It feels good to get that work done that I need to get worked on. I would prefer to wash dishes, but hey, you sort of take it and make it something that is good. And that idea of the sublime is actually translated for us from Longinus as a feeling that you might get when you speak or when you write, I would assume as well. When we speak, a lot of times we feel, some of us feel pleasure from being able to speak and hear our own voice, from being able to feel the audience learn from us or be persuaded by us, or when we're giving information out that's really, really important and we know that we're helping people. So the sublime can occur in that moment when we know we have persuaded someone. So the art of rhetoric becomes the art of the sublime, the art of making things feel sublime and being sublime as a practice at the same time. So why didn't I have you read that? Because it's boring and I feel like I just summed it up in about 1 minute and 52 seconds. That's why. I probably have the timing wrong, but get the idea. What we're really interested in is what was going on in Rome after Longinus had written that piece. We're more interested. And prior to the Roman period that we generally talk about, there is another piece that nobody knows who it was authored by. Some people say Cicero authored it. Other people attribute it to others whose names are escaping me at the moment. But I happen to think it was probably not Cicero. But it is all about what we call the stasis system. Now, you remember that that stasis is that point in between two oppositional but equal points or concepts or ideas that is where rhetoric begins. It's a point of stability where we have to make a choice and we have to have rhetoric begin. And I apologize, I have a heating pad on my chair and I'm like moving around, so my bad. I apologize for that. So the stasis system is based on that idea that we're going to start from that point of two colliding things. I think we made a Harry Potter reference last week. And what we're looking for is specifically that system or that question based on sort of court in the courts. So guilt and innocence, right? They go back and forth. The stasis system is actually still used today. It is the series of questions that you would ask, and in the order that you would ask them if you were a lawyer trying to find the truth. So it's the actual questioning process for the purpose of finding the truth. And it is starting at the point of stasis. It's starting at the point where we don't know which way it's supposed to go. And it's pretty interesting because law schools actually still use the stasis system as sort of a process for for how to question a witness. Now, we've gotten more creative than the stasis system that's described there, but for the most part, the basic idea that you would ask this question before this question and this question after that, and if you needed to follow up, here's how you would do it. Very, very logical, linear process for asking questions in a court case, okay? So I believe that was actually written by a guy named Hermagoras. Like I said, some people attribute it to Cicero, some to others, but Hermagoras seems to be the best argument by the historians, if you ask me. So why is that important? Because the stasis system was kept alive by the sophists. And importantly, Aristotle said that stasis is where rhetoric begins. And so in Rome, as they were establishing their government, they looked to ancient Greece because looked up to ancient Greece. They used it as a model. Now, Greece was supposed to be sort of a direct democracy, and Rome knew that it was not going to be a direct democracy. They knew that there were going to have flaws in the system where there had to be some sort of representation, right? So what they established is what we call a republic. The idea that the citizens of the republic were represented by those who knew more and those who were able to demonstrate more. And if Aristotle is right, that a rhetorician is a person who explains the government to its people, then obviously you need rhetoricians working in your government. And those higher up were called senators. They didn't have a House of Representatives or a House of Commons. They had a Senate, and they had a public forum, and they had this idea that all issues could be settled by committee, for the most part, by this large body of senators. Now, there weren't 100 like we have, but there were many of them, some more famous than others. I'm sure you remember Caligula. That's everybody's favorite Roman, right? It's like the best story ever is Caligula. And then you, of course, have other senators like Cicero who stood up and who became more powerful or less powerful. And most of the time, this was based on their speaking ability. Cicero was considered one of the most powerful senators because of his speaking ability. He was considered to be the prime example of the best orator. Now, Cicero really didn't like how he spoke. He wasn't a big fan of his own work, but he wrote this awesome book. We often call it the first student textbook on public speaking. He took all of Aristotle's works, he put them together and organized them. He organized them into five basic rules, 5 canon laws, 5 canons for rhetoric. And he put them into a certain order, not because, some of them weren't important. It's just that He felt that if you went through the process in this order, you were most likely to be successful. So he took Aristotle's work and he rearranged them. So anybody who says Aristotle is credited with the 5 canons of rhetoric, well, they're just wrong. And here's why. Even though Aristotle covered most of what's in the 5 canons, he, number one, didn't cover all of it. And number two, he certainly didn't organize it the way that Cicero did. Cicero was so good at being able to teach and to demonstrate and to explain the process of rhetoric. So hopefully when you read the piece from Cicero, which I think is De Orate, I forget the names because they're so similar. But yes, he wrote, did he write the Institute? You guys will figure that out. I believe it's De Orate. So when he wrote that, which literally translates to of oratory, he was really looking at how do we teach public speaking? In other words, how do we teach rhetoric? So 5 canons. Start off with the first one, invention. It is the most important because if you don't go through that process, you won't have anything to speak about. Now, in COM 115 and some other classes, you've heard invention, you've heard a topic, but that's not exactly all that goes into invention. Hopefully, as you've read, you've picked up on that. Invention includes picking the right topic to be talked about in the correct way for the purpose of persuading and finding the right inartificial and artificial proofs, artistic or artistic proofs, for the purpose of making the best argument. So it's not just topic choice, okay? I'm not going to eat a fish is not invention, okay? But knowing like why you're talking about beta fish, what your audience is going to need from you, and what evidence you're going to use, what credibility you have, and how you're going to get them to care about beta fish, which, let's face it, it's hard to do. They're about as popular as the axolotl. At least they're pretty. So beta fish as a topic is not the process of invention. Invention also includes those artistic and artistic proofs that I talked about last week, ethos, pathos, and logos. So the process of logic comes in here as well. What is going to be the best evidence to use, the best reasoning to use, etc. Second, number 2, arrangement. Arrangement, it does not mean organization. Okay, partly it does, but it's not actually organization just by itself. Arrangement is more about the right way to arrange, to order, or to progress through a speech for the purpose of making the argument clear to your audience. So if you arrange your speech properly, your audience will always know where you're coming from, what you're talking about, and where you're going. And in fact, they can usually predict what's going to come at the end of the speech. So arrangement is not just organization, transitions, and things like that. Arrangement is, how is my argument going to be made? Now, in writing, which we're not really sure if Cicero was talking about that or not, but in writing, this gets messed with all the time in the new era, the postmodern era. But prior to the 1960s, this wasn't really messed with. I mean, the great American novels and back all do the same things, all the way back to the epic poetry of ancient Greece. They explain who the characters are. They start the plot. It works its way up to a climax, and then it concludes. And they all follow very similar tropes. They all use very similar ideas. And that's the way it was until the 1960s or so. And we will talk about that later. Today is not that day. So when Cicero writes about arrangement, he's talking about the logical progression of your argument that will best help your audience understand where your argument is going, what your argument is, and remember it as well. which brings us to the third, the third canon, which is style. I believe that Bazell and Hertzberg still put style third. There's some debate about the last three, but usually style is third. What do we mean by style? Well, that's a darn good question. Aristotle wasn't really clear on this. He just said, use a style that's appropriate to your audience. Does that mean, So Cicero gets a little clearer, and he explains that there's three levels of style. There is what's known as the grand style, what is known as the common style, and what is known, aptly as the middle style, which falls between grand and common, in case you can't figure that out. Now, common did not mean everyday conversation. It didn't mean talk and jive with your audience. It meant a formal speech that utilizes tropes and words and sentence structure that an audience of everyday, Senate attendees could understand, or everyday citizens, I should say, could understand, even if they weren't a part of the Senate. Like that, if I went to your town and explained to you what happened in the Senate that day, I would use maybe the common style if I'm in a very rural part of Rome. I don't know what part wasn't rural. Hey, they did invent toilets. Let's give them that. So, you would have to be able to understand who your audience is. The grand style, according to Cicero, was literally big gestures, like really enthusiastic and extreme eloquence, okay? And this was not always necessary, but it was a formal style of speech that really, probably was reserved for special occasions. It was generally reserved for your epidictic address, honestly. And it was sort of dramatic. And if you didn't read it, or if it's not in Bazell and Hertzberg's latest editions, Cicero at one point starts talking about when you should remove your toga to get attention, and like what color of toga to wear. I mean, just like bizarre ideas about style. But one thing we do know is that he was talking about big hand gestures that were helpful to your argument, that got an audience's attention, that was a high practice of eloquence, and was normally used in epidictic address, which was meant to attack or defend the character of another. What's middle? Between there. Now, some people will tell you that the common language is street language and middle is what you might do in school. That's kind of inaccurate, to be honest with you. I find that it's easier to talk about it in terms of like presidents. Now, you can disagree with me on this, but let me give you an example of how I think about it, and you can kind of get a sense of what you might think once you read Cicero and hear this lecture. I always use the example of Ronald Reagan and Barack Obama as using the grand style of speaking, right? I mean, they both were either overly rehearsed and practiced as an actor like Ronald Reagan, or they were overly dramatic and slow like Barack Obama, right? And even though he had a lot of I say they're called vocal fillers. Even though he had a lot of vocal fillers, he paused a lot. His utilization of what we call power pause, his utilization of eloquence, those who said he was an elitist because of the way that he spoke, all of that indicates that he was invoking a grand style. You could disagree. Like I said, that's not a big deal. I'm just trying to find a way to demonstrate how I think about them. The middle style I really put to H.W. Bush, Jimmy Carter. They were really formal and definitely were practicing the office of the presidency at all times. They spoke in a language that more people might understand, or that a less elitist or less, I won't say educated, maybe knowledgeable audience really would would be able to listen to. That's not to say that they were talking down or using simple language. It just means that they used tropes and figures and references that were more common than Reagan or Obama. The question is then, what about the common style? Who could possibly have used that? I'm pretty sure Bill Clinton and George W. Bush qualify as two of the most formal presidents who utilized the common style of speaking. I mean, remember, I'd love to go have a beer with him. Or do you wear flannel boxers or do you wear tidy whities? What do you wear? Mr. President. I mean, they asked Bill Clinton that. He played the saxophone on Jay Leno. They were both very down to earth, sort of common speaking style. And again, this has nothing to do with W's flub ups or his mistakes that we commonly like to make fun of. It has to do with just his and Clinton's willingness to reach out to identify with the audience a little bit differently than other presidents did. If you asked me what Donald Trump's style is, I don't know. Game show host? I don't know what that qualifies as. In watching the State of the Union this year, and if you didn't watch the State of the Union, you may not get this reference, but it was like watching a game show. It's like, oh, here's a college scholarship for you. And oh, look, I brought your husband back from Iraq after however many months. And oh, you get to spend time with the head of the Space Force. It was like some sort of weird style of speaking that I don't think any of us were expecting. The State of the Union normally has a very rigid flow to it. And if you go back and look at Bill Clinton's State of the Unions, where, yeah, he had 10 points, okay? The dude went on forever. I'm not going to, I mean, that's no joke, but he would actually signpost everything. So if he said, there are 10 things that we need to know about the state of our union, you knew when he was on number 9 that you were almost done with the speech. So he always told you where he was and you knew what was coming next. With Trump, we don't get that. With George W. Bush, 43, we knew that he was going to stay on topic, even if he couldn't pronounce the words. Like, we knew where he was going, so we could understand it. We knew what topics. They always put out what topics they were going to talk about prior to the speech for the purpose of helping the audience understand and know what was coming, because that predictability helped us understand what the president was saying. So I don't know if that helped or just muddied the waters, but I don't know that Cicero would agree with me either, but we are not in a Roman republic. So obviously, he may disagree, but I think that if you read those 3 levels of style, you'll get a really good understanding of what Cicero was trying to accomplish there. The fourth, I'm sorry, I should go like this, like the fourth. I'm sorry, I've been messing up on my fingers all night long. Fourth, I obviously can't do a. Yeah. The fourth one is, again, this is debatable, is memory, memoria. That's how I learned it. And memory does not mean memorization, okay? Way back in the times of the Roman Republic and the ancient Greeks, they had no mass media system, they had no newspaper. So to share information from the Senate or new laws or whatever, they had to send all these people, young men, out to speak to different designated places. They had to take this information back to their people that they were representing and explain to them what was going on. Well, I mean, that requires you to remember what the message is. It does not require you to memorize something and to continually repeat it in that exact form. It requires you to be able to express the message. Now, if you remember reading, I don't know, did I have you guys read Phaedrus by Plato? if we did read that, Plato uses a speech that was given by Lysias, and Phaedrus repeats the speech like partially, but Plato repeats it 2.5 times. And he's trying to prove that you can use rhetoric to change the notions in a speech anytime that you want. And that's what's bad about rhetoric for Plato. During the Roman Republic, that idea of memoria, of being able to capture the essence of the speech and the main ideas and the essence of the main ideas was really what memoria was about. So if I give a speech and it's a good lecture and you're like, oh, I got a lot out of that, and you're going to give that lecture to somebody else, it's not going to be exactly the same. At least I hope not. You should definitely be putting your own style into it while still being able to get the points across. So that's what memoria really is, or memory. And last but not least, certainly, because remember, these are 5 canons, which means they're 5 basic pillars, rules of law. You can't practice rhetoric without them, without all of them. Delivery is put last, really, because if you don't have something to say, a logical way to say it, know how to say it, and remember what to say, then it doesn't matter how good your delivery is, right? But of course, when we talked about style, people say, well, style and delivery is the same thing. It's not. Delivery is literally your ability to get the words out, and most often actually focuses on non-verbal behavior. So the non-verbals and the paralanguage that you use is really what falls under delivery, because you can say absolutely nothing and it will sound absolutely beautiful. But Aristotle, all the way through Cicero, would tell you that's a pointless practice. So the 5 canons are invention, inventio, arrangement, dispositio, style, or elocutio, memory, or memoria, and delivery, or actio. So actio, the word act, the ability to make an act out of the speech that you have created. So there you go. And that basically sums up Cicero. He lived during the time of the Roman Republic, a time when more people were supposed to have power rather than the few. Of course, that's questionable, but that was the general idea. And Cicero believed that you could help people move through the classes, to move from a lower class to a bigger, to a more, I don't know how far you can move up, really, to be honest with you. All these guys we talk about were born into privilege for the most part. Including Cicero, by the way. But the idea that you could use rhetoric to produce something different in your life, that you could use it to explain the government to the people, that if you practiced it well, that you would be able to move through the ranks of, perhaps, if not the Senate, then through some of the lower city-state offices. Okay. Now, another thing that Cicero talks about that I think is important is narrative. I gotta be honest with you, I should have looked this up. I don't know if it was Cicero who came up with the 3 types of narrative, or if that was Quintilian. So I'm actually kind of shy about that, because I do have my Google machine, but I don't want to take the time to try to look that up. So you correct me, okay? If it was Cicero, that's great. The 3 kinds of narratives I always thought was very important, and I'll use this as my segue to Quintilian and maybe try to pretend like I know what I'm talking about on this one. But the 3 types of narrative are very interesting. One is realistic, one is humorous, and the other one is fictional. I think those are the 3 names that Bizel and Hertzberg use. If not, the definitions will be the same. The historical one is based in something that has happened, and we're utilizing it as part of the speech to demonstrate, or as a lesson for the audience. The fictional one, it's not called historical, it's called realistic. I really think it's called realistic. Nope, I'm wrong. It's historical. So the historical one has actually happened. The realistic narrative could potentially happen, or it could have potentially been true, right? And you use that narrative to demonstrate either future potential or to compare something. So metaphorically, and then of course the humorous story is the one that is the least content driven, and it's really intended to get the audience's attention to a particular subject. You've seen me go off on a tangent and you've been like, why is she doing that? A part of that just might be trying to get everybody in the room's attention back to the subject matter of the speech. So, tangent or humorous story, one or the other, because I also don't know if that was Cicero or Quintilian. This is embarrassing. Man, my mind is a sieve. It's terrible what happens when you get old. So, but that does lead us to Quintilian. And of course, between Cicero and Quintilian, there were some major historical happenings. First of all, Jesus was born. I'm not saying that that's the most important thing, but it sort of defined the eras and the calendar that we use and things like that. It also marked the end of the Roman Republic. Now, for those of you who don't know, essentially there were a few people who wanted power, and those people who wanted power were actually trying to get Cicero to agree to be one of 4 people in power. And Cicero said, no, we should not concentrate power all at the top. Like, that's not a republic. Sound familiar? Because it's not. It's not a republic if you have 4 people in charge. I don't know what they'd even call that. Anyway, Cicero refused. And there is like the soap opera version of this story, and there's like probably the more likely true historical version. The historical version, which is boring, but the historical version is that the 3 who wanted to rule, who eventually became the triumvirate, which worked its way into an empire, obviously, eventually. But the triumvirate, the story goes that they got together and they found someone to kill Cicero. The way that they did it was they chopped out his tongue, they cut off his hands, they nailed his tongue and his hands to either the entrance to the city or to the entrance to the Senate. That's a questionable thing, but it was one of those two. And they put his head on a pike. So, I don't know. Hopefully he wasn't alive for all that, but, well, at least for most of it. But you get the idea. Why his tongue and why his hands? Well, Cicero is considered to be the greatest orator. Some say of all time. It's difficult to know. I mean, in the last millennium, the number one speaker in, we did like this big poll. When I say we, I mean communication scholars and media scholars. We all got together and did this poll, and the unanimous number one speaker, or speech, I should say, was Martin Luther King's I Have a Dream speech, which maybe surprises some of you. Maybe not. I'm not particularly surprised by that. It's not like there aren't other good options, though. I mean, Kennedy's inaugural speech was great. Reagan's speech after the Challenger was fantastic, but none of them rose to the level, in our opinion, of the speech of Martin Luther King. And of course, that was in the 60s, and it was definitely prior to 1968. I think it was somewhere in the 60s. I would have to look up the exact date, but we do know it was like sort of mid-century. So it wasn't even like we got more fantastic as life went on. We did a little bit, but not greatly so. In fact, the top 10 speeches, I believe, are all from prior to 1980. So, those last 20 years or so, not so great. Seeing as I was born in 74, this is a little insulting. But the idea of the greatest orator of all times at that time was Cicero. His power came from his ability to speak and create truth, in a way. His power was in teaching citizens and empowering them. His power was in his hands when he gestured and taught. So the historical version, a little bit boring, not too bad though. Some blood and guts at least. There's still blood and guts in the soap opera version. The soap opera version is that Cleopatra and Mark Antony were involved because Mark Antony would actually get her to Caesar, or get Caesar to her. So they would pass messages. But rumor has it that she said to Caesar, hey, don't ask me which one. Hey, listen, this Cicero dude, he is getting way too powerful. Cleopatra was a very smart woman. He's getting too powerful. He is the one who is going to cause your downfall. So make sure that you get rid of him. And Mark Antony, would you please bring me Cicero's head on a platter? That was sort of the story that's sort of the soap opera version, and probably is completely untrue. But it's kind of fun to think about it in those terms, that there would be somebody saying, hey, and it would be a woman, which is fantastic, saying, hey, that guy's getting too powerful. He's too good of a speaker. You might want to do something about that. And of course, the idea that Cicero was giving power to others or attempting to help them have power suggests a dispersion of power, or what we might consider a decentralization of power. Right? The power is all around. It's not centralized. It's shared amongst many. Democracies are considered to be decentralized powers. Well, if you only have 3 rulers, guess what? No longer a decentralized power. Some people claim that rhetoric or the Republic died the day that Cicero was put to death. And that may be true because from then on, they just kept getting fewer and fewer leaders. They went to 3 and then to 1. And then, to Brute, things got crazy. And so thus the rise of the Roman Empire. Notice I did not say the Holy Roman Empire, because not yet. So the rise of the Roman Empire, and during the time of the rise of the Roman Empire, guess what was not distributed? That would be power, and therefore rhetoric was not really taught. It wasn't really spread. People practiced it in the courts, but that's pretty much it. So how do we have quintillion then? Well, first of all, let's talk about the general rule that we can learn from the Roman Republic and the Roman Empire, which is this. The more centralized a power, the less need there is for rhetoric. I know what you're thinking. Hitler rose to power with good rhetoric. Maybe he did. But if you have a centralized power, your people aren't being convinced of anything, and I don't need to understand how to function in the government anymore because I'm just told what to do. So the need for rhetoric decreases when there's centralization of power. When you have a more decentralized power, like a democracy, for example, whether it's a Republican democracy or a direct democracy, whichever way you want to think about it, there is a great need for rhetoric because the citizens and the people need to understand what's going on in the government, how it's being run, and what new rules and laws we need to follow. Okay, so the more centralized a government, the less need for rhetoric. The more decentralized a government, the greater the need for rhetoric. In the Republic, we have a more decentralized government. We're moving towards a very centralized government. And so the practice of rhetoric was pretty much deemed as bad because you didn't want everyday citizens to have the power to rise through the practice of rhetoric. Dare I make a Hamilton reference here? I will not. I'll spare you. So we have to find a way to practice rhetoric for Quintilian then, or he needs to figure out a way, I should say. We don't have to do it. And he did. If Cicero wrote the student textbook for public speaking, then Quintilian wrote the teacher's edition, the teacher's handbook. What Quintilian did was he convinced the Roman rulers that their children and those in power needed to be taught how to maintain that power through the art of rhetoric. So he sort of wrote this book that said, here's how I teach rhetoric. That's the Institutio de Oratory, which I really hope I've got those right. Awkward moment when you forget which one's which, but I believe I have those correct. So the institution of oratory starts off with a different idea of what rhetoric truly is. And he's surprised, quite frankly, I'm surprised he didn't get killed for saying this. The first thing that Quintilian does is he redefines rhetoric by saying that a good rhetorician or a good orator is a good man, sick, human, speaking well. Okay, so why is that so different? You speak well, you're a good rhetorician, right? No, that first part, very important. A good person speaking well, meaning that you had to have ethics, meaning that you had to have that goodwill towards your audience that Aristotle talked about, or that you needed to want your people to follow you and to like you. And so you were a good person if you were doing this public service. And we sort of see how Quintilian's trying to undermine sort of the problems of him wanting to teach rhetoric in a very centralized government where rhetoric was not considered important and rhetoric was actually kind of sort of illegal. It was definitely discouraged, and he did not want to end up like his favorite person in the whole wide world, Cicero. So what he did was he wrote a handbook. Here's how you would practice it if you wanted to, not how, here's how I teach it to the royals or to those in power so that they can maintain it. And he was actually paid to teach the children of upper classes how to speak to Caesar. Of course, they had a Senate. It was a fabrication during the empire. So that's sort of where rhetoric lived. Quintilian gives some very specific ideas. Again, if he's the one who came up with the three styles of narrative, I feel really bad right now. He also followed the 5 canons. He did that in a very similar way. But bringing that idea of ethics into rhetoric again becomes important because, hey, look at this. I've almost gotten an hour in and I'm on time. I was going to do an hour lecture, so this feels pretty good. So Quintilian wrote this handbook for teachers, and he lived a long, healthy life and a good life, and he was not drawn and quartered or had his tongue cut out or anything. He was not punished. He just sort of went on. We know that there were some great students of Plato, Aristotle, and those, but who were the great students of Cicero and Quintilian? We don't hear about them. Why? What happened? Well, question. Where is the Roman Catholic Church located? Rome. Okay, so the power started to centralize, the world power, particularly the Western world power, because, the Eastern world still existed, but we like to pretend that it didn't. Mainly because in the Eastern worlds, they did not need rhetoric. They were not democracies. Yet, it was Islamic monks who saved the texts of the ancients. And it was the Roman Catholic Church that was destroying them. Okay, why? Well, as the church rose to power, it decided that the only truth you need to seek is through God. And the only way to do that is to be educated on the Bible. And the only way to do that is to listen to, that's right, the church. And the leader of the church is the Pope. So the Pope becomes, the extreme ruler, and the church becomes the authority on truth, on goodness, and on philosophy. You don't need to look outside of that. And when we're talking about the Bible here, we're really talking about the history of what the Roman Catholic Church wanted you to adhere to and abide by. And of course, I don't have a Bible from that long ago. I don't really know, but or the stories from a long time ago. But the New Testament is what you followed, and you didn't need to know any more than that. All you need to know was what God and the Pope told you. And only the Pope could tell you what God told you. So there you go. You go to church, you get the truth, and you don't think any further than that, and you move on. Why? One, rhetoric was developed by pagans. That's bad, right? If you're the Catholic Church, that's bad. Two, by the way, these are not in any order. Two, rhetoric, the practice of rhetoric, made you seek other truths that were falsities, by the way, false gods, if you will, false truths, by asking questions beyond the Bible. You didn't need to do that. God already gave you all the answers you need. Just stay right there. Number three, rhetoric could, and this is a direct quotation, it's a direct quotation, could arouse the passions. Now, that I say that very sinisterly because it doesn't mean like, oh my God, somebody just gave a great speech, I'm horny. Although, whatever. I don't think that usually happens. But you do, go back to sublimation, get a really good feeling when you're speaking and you know that your audience is being persuaded by you and you know that these people are paying attention. And I don't know if you've ever watched someone with really strong power speak and think, boy, they're really attractive. And then when you see them outside of that context of power, maybe not so much, right? But some people become more attractive with power. And if you're speaking and you're speaking well, that looks powerful. So it can arouse the passions that way. Another way is some people just really like to argue. Who? Me? Maybe. And in debate, when I did debate, we had this thing called good debater syndrome, or GDS. And basically that means I'd be like, oh, look at that guy. I actually have a guy in my head right now. I'm thinking of the name, but I'm not going to say it because he's a very well-respected professor in the field, not at our university, but he's very good. But I would watch him debate. And I'm like, oh my gosh, I just love watching him debate. And he's hot, and he's this, and he's that. Dude's ugly. But because he was such a good debater and because he was so powerful when he spoke, there was an attractiveness there. And, I actually feel that way about some of my college professors, particularly in my PhD program. There's one from the English department at Mizzou when I was there. He is now at Carnegie Mellon the last time I checked, but he was not an attractive man. But when he was speaking, you feel an attraction for them. So rhetoric aroused the passions and could arouse the passions, and therefore it was a bad practice, okay? Because sex was evil. Number four, the first entity to practice rhetoric was Satan in the form of a snake. So rhetoric's getting a bad rap left and right. I mean, the snake convinced Eve to eat the fruit of the tree of knowledge. It was not an apple, we don't think. But she did. And then she convinced Adam. Now, I think there's probably multiple ways she could have convinced Adam, but, the idea that evil comes from the practice of rhetoric, that persuading someone to do something wrong or against God's will, the fact that it could be used for that was another reason why rhetoric was considered evil. So There's 4 really good reasons why rhetoric was considered evil when the church came around. A 5th reason was because it led to questioning. And if you think about it, of course it does. It originated with the idea of studying philosophy, of asking what is good, what is true, what is right. So yeah, it's an exploration of the truth. And if you already have the truth from God, why do you need to go exploring it? Don't go chasing waterfalls here, people. Make sure that you stay right in the lakes and ponds you're used to. I really did just make a TLC reference. You guys probably don't get it, but that's okay. You can look it up later. And so you want to stay in your lane, so to speak, and only learn what was going on in the Bible that you needed to know. This is how we get to the ruling system of you must be Catholic Church or you must be killed, right? Like Charles the Great, St. Charles, King Charles, the guy who cut people's head off, Charlemagne, that dude. Do you believe in Jesus? No. Which, by the way, left a lot of Eastern cultures in some pretty bad shape if they were here. If you've seen Robin Hood, you know exactly what I'm talking about. So some Christians were really practicing some really terrible practices at this time. Some Catholics, there weren't really any other Christians. I think pretty much it was all Catholics. And so the Holy Roman Church then begins this idea of the divine right of kings. I don't really know when that happens. Get a historian. But the divine right of kings basically says that a person is made king because they are chosen by God. Of course, the Pope was in charge of everyone, and then the kings, and then after the kings, there were knights, and the knights would fight on behalf of the king. And under the knights, there were lords, and the lords lorded over the land, and these pieces of land were known as sort of fiefdoms, I don't know, community of some sort, and then each family or so had a part of that fiefdom to work on, and those were called serfs. And you might work for hundreds of years on that one small piece of land. And by you, I mean your family. So people never saw the city. They never knew anything other than go to church, work on the land, eat, sleep, go to church, work on the land, because all they needed to know was what the church told them and what the Bible told them. And so nobody had a need to read. Nobody had a need to learn. Bad times for rhetoric, known as the Dark Ages for a reason. So how is rhetoric going to survive these next 12 to 1800 years? Well, we've got 3 people that are important during this time that I think I have you read parts of, or some of, or all of. No, I don't make you read all of anything. The piece that you're going to read from the main person that we refer to, of course, is St. Augustine. If you call him Augustine, that's totally cool. By the way, if you go on YouTube and you look up a video called St. Augustine or St. Augustine, spelled the same way, it's just a matter of how you pronounce it. I've always said Augustine. Other people say Augustine. If you look up a video on YouTube, just type in like Augustine and Confessions, you'll get this like terrible school-created rap where they use both the name Augustine and Augustine in a very creative way. And of course, they're talking about his Confessions, which I mentioned last time, is where he says, I want to do good, but I'm just not ready. The mind is willing, or the spirit is willing, but the body is weak, and grant me patience, Lord, but hurry. And I'm just not ready to be a good guy yet, because he was born into a family where his mother was Catholic, His father was a pagan, and he was born in North Africa, the north portion of Africa, known as Tagaste, I believe is how you pronounced that at the time. And he was a sophist, and he practiced, and he made tons of money, and he spent it on women and wine and food. He was obviously a large man. He did have well, we won't say wife, but like sort of a common law partner, and he had a child, but both of them died very early on. So there was no continuation of that. Augustine, his mother prayed that he would become a Catholic, that he would convert, and so, or to Christianity, and so he did eventually convert, and he became, well, he wasn't known as St. Augustine until after he was dead, but he became a preacher. And in his work, you're going to learn what rhetoric was used for, why we should use it in the church. He's going to answer some of those criticisms about rhetoric. For example, if rhetoric was used by the devil, then we should use it to fight the devil. I feel like I told you all this already. Maybe I did. Here's a reminder. But he says that, it is the truth. We don't need to use rhetoric to explore the truth, but we do need to pray before we speak. Because if we don't, then we're not going to be able to share God's truth, and we need to be able to do that. So he gives us 3 things that we use rhetoric for in the church, and that's to preach, to teach, and to convert. And you'll read more about that as you read St. Augustine. I don't know if I have you reading about Christine de Pizan or about Margaret Fell. If I have you reading them, great. If not, I'll be talking about them next week. All right, and I'm just over my hour limit by a minute and a half. So I'm going to stop this video here. And if you have any questions about any of that, please feel free to text them to me or ask me them next week or whatnot, particularly focusing on Cicero and Quintilian. If you have questions about their ideas and theories of rhetoric, please let me know. All right, peace out, people. Thank you for understanding. I'm going to go and get this heating pad unplugged, and I'm going to move to my couch. So I hope you all are having a safe and warm day. As much as you can, snuggle up with some hot chocolate and read your textbook. Talk to you soon.